Thank you very much. Thank you. I'm so honored to be able to be with you. I'm sorry that I'm not there in person, and I apologize in advance if my voice gives out. I have an unfortunate timing for this case of laryngitis. But let's get into it because I'd like to be able to take as many questions as possible. So, I'm not going to do a comprehensive survey over what it is that social psychology has to say about conflict. I'm going to focus on one piece of it that I've been studying. But of course, there are many other fields and many other experts who have weighed in on this incredibly complex problem. There are leaders and central actors who foment, carry out, and perpetuate conflict. And again, many experts from many diverse disciplines have weighed in on what economic, what political, what geosocial, even climate conditions allow these actors to succeed. But as a psychologist, I also focus on the social context of conflict. So, what is happening with everybody else besides the central actors or the political elites? Who supports the conflict? Who protests? What do they think that everybody else around them thinks? Does everyone around me think that we should remain hateful? Even if I don't feel that way personally, that's a very strong tide against which to swim. So, the ways that coalitions form and reform, that is what I call the physics of groups, and the conditions under which threat turns to conflict and then turns to violence are really changing under the influence of information technology. And this is the piece of the next 5 to 10 years that I've been thinking about a lot. You know, humans are not dispassionate processors of information. Just as prisms bend light, so too minds distort information, making some information more likely to be noticed, remembered, and of course shared. Now, these influences, these biases of the mind, they can have outsized impacts. Why is that? Well, for example, individuals have a tendency to attend to, learn from, and weigh negative news more heavily than positive or neutral news. And this negativity bias may be further compounded by factors such as this thing called the availability heuristic. And this just leads people to consider events to be more likely, to be more true, to be more credible, so as long as we can readily recall similar exemplars. And this is why threatening propaganda can be incredibly effective in generating hatred against particular groups or organizations, even when it has very little basis in reality. So I guess the point is that even if there was no mis or disinformation being broadcast to the public, we still wouldn't have a clear picture of the truth in our minds. And this matters because these false beliefs, of course, inform behavior. Now, as conflicts escalate, we observe a movement of groups away from one another on a number of dimensions. I'll use a buzzword, polarization, to refer to this distancing, but this is not unique to political contexts, the US, and so on. It could be religious strife, conflict over resources, whatever is the dividing fissure between two sets of people. So, what do I mean when I say distancing or polarization? Sometimes when we talk about it, what we mean is how extreme individuals' positions are for or against an issue. That is, when they move from being more moderate to extreme, we say they're becoming more polarized. Other times, polarization refers to the gap between two parties on a given issue. So, how far away they're moving from agreement or away from coordination on a given issue, value, or resource is the polarization process. Now, other times, polarization refers to how much each side dislikes the other side. And this is what we social psychologists tend to call prejudice. Of course, as conflict heats up and threat increases, so too does prejudice or dislike of the other group. Yet other times, though, polarization refers to people's beliefs about how extreme different people, sects, parties are. Other times, it's about their beliefs about how much parties disagree. And these beliefs matter for behavior. For example, inaccurate, pessimistic beliefs about the other side's feelings tend to be associated with our own decreased trust, negative expectancies about mutual interactions, and so on. So the farther I think you are from me, the less I trust you, the less I want to talk to you. And in this way, conjured or perceived polarization can actually lead to true polarization. Now, to make this extremely psychological, sometimes polarization refers to what we believe they believe about us. And that's something my colleagues and I call meta perceptions, what we think they think about us. So you may be wondering, why do I think these matter at all in conflict? They're just beliefs. I argue that meta perceptions are special because they're forecasts related to the possibility of coordination. What I think you think about me and my group guides whether or not I believe there's any credible chance of us getting together and getting something done. Now, lots of groups coexist in the world, even groups that fundamentally disagree with one another or are in direct competition with one another. And they can be that way without any outbreaks of violence. And so the question is why? Because it turns out most people don't want violence. It's incredibly costly to everybody involved. But one major feature of conflict context that tips people into violence is when it appears that all other means of coordination are no longer available. They are off the table. So if my meta perceptions are overly negative, I believe that you are outraged about me and everything that my group does. That potentially forecloses on the possibility that we could get anything done because it would be a waste of time to try. And so this situation, in less dramatic terms than what we've seen unfolding in the Middle East this weekend, would surmise the current situation in American politics. So we were wondering whether or not people do have these distorted, overly pessimistic perceptions. This is work led by my colleague Jeff Lees in collaboration with myself. So in the spring of 2019, we asked a representative sample of Democrats and Republicans to read a series of scenarios about inter-party sabotage. And the scenarios ranged across a variety of behaviors, from one party changing the name of a highway to a beloved in-party member, to one party gerrymandering a district in their favor so as to make it more likely that they would win the election. And so then each respondent was assigned to one of three treatment conditions. In the actual perception condition, we just asked Democrats and Republicans, how much would you dislike it if the other party engaged in this behavior? So this gives us sort of ground truth of people's honest reactions. In the in-group perception condition, we asked people, how much would the average fellow party member dislike it if the other party engaged in this behavior? So we'll call this in-group perceptions. This is what you think other members of your own party believe. And then finally, in the group meta-perception condition, we asked people, how much would the average out-group member dislike it if your party engaged in this obstructive behavior? So here are some of the data. What I'm showing you here is the amount of dislike reported by people in each of these three different situations. So let's talk about actual perceptions first. This is indicated in red. So what you'll see here is that averaged across our participants, Democrats and Republicans, and also across these different scenarios, they tended to indicate a dislike around the midpoint of the scale, right? It's 55 out of 100. They didn't like these certain scenarios, but they weren't enraged. Well, what about estimates for a fellow party member, which is indicated in green here? Here we already start to see some distortions in people's beliefs. People think that in-group members will be more upset than they themselves are, to a tune of about 10 points. But now let's turn our attention to the meta-perception condition. What you see is that the average estimate is 3/4 of the way to the ceiling, with lots of responses clustering at 100, maximal outrage. In other words, people believe that the other side is going to be apoplectic about pretty much anything that they do. And it turns out that their estimates are inflated by about 40% relative to what the other side actually said they felt when benchmarked against people's actual responses. So one thing we were wondering was whether or not these distortions had any sort of consequences for other kinds of attributions that people make to their outgroups. So things like, what kind of motives do they attribute to them? And so we tested the consequences of these pessimistic distortions by giving them scenarios, asking them about their meta-perception beliefs, and then finally asking them to what extent they thought that the other side was motivated by purposeful obstructionism. That is, irrespective of the costs that it imposed on U.S. citizens, how much are they just functioning to stay in power and to obstruct our interests? What we find is that the more people said that the other side would dislike, oppose, and find acceptable the actions of their own party, the more selfishly obstructionist they thought that they were. And it turns out that this isn't just the case in the domain of U.S. politics. So, for example, my colleagues Emile Bruno, Noor Khaili, and others have found that Americans who learn that Arabs or Muslims blatantly dehumanize Americans are not only more likely to dehumanize Muslims and Arabs back, they're more likely to say that they support torture and drone strikes. They find that this replicates with Hungarians' beliefs about Roma people, Israelis' beliefs about Palestinians, and so on. So, in other words, across contexts and cultures, overly negative meta perceptions make people believe the worst of the other side and encourage support for hostile actions against them. I imagine this sounds all very dispiriting, but there is a silver lining here. Unlike intervening on actual polarization that is trying to change people's actual issue positions or their actual prejudices, it turns out this is very difficult. Combating misperceptions of polarization is just about improving accuracy, specifically improving accuracy about how they see us. And this highlights another way in which meta perceptions are incredibly powerful. They're ultimately about us, what I think they think about us. Humans have a fundamental drive to be liked and to be respected. So when I learned that the other side isn't as hateful toward me and my group as I thought, that potentially has a chance to land. Said another way, people may be uniquely sensitive to corrective information about how others see us, certainly more sensitive than they are about how wrong they are about them. So we ran a study where we corrected half of our respondents' misperceptions. So we gave them a scenario, received their meta perceptions. Half of them, we gave them corrective info that said, you thought that the other party would dislike this to a tune of 90. Actually, we surveyed the other party and they said 56. And then the other condition, we gave them no new information. We said on the previous page, you indicated that the other party would feel 90 out of 100 on dislike. And then finally, we also asked them the purposeful obstructionism. What I'm showing you here is the effect of the control condition where we gave them no corrective information versus the truth intervention. And what you should be paying attention to here is how that blue bar drops when we give them corrective information. So what we found was that correcting people's misperceptions, specifically for those people who are inaccurate in the first place about how the other group feels, reduced the degree to which they attributed negative motivations to the other side. And it turns out these results replicated across cultures and group contexts. So as part of a team of over 80 researchers, we replicated this effect with more than 10,000 participants spread over 26 countries. So the meta perceptions here, indicated by country, are always marked in blue. And what you'll see is they're always more extreme than the actual feelings of the respondents from that same place, which is marked in red. We also replicated our intervention effect in almost all of the countries in which we could run a second study. The other thing I think is important to note is that other researchers have found that these meta perceptions can be much more specific than just sort of abstract or vague feelings. They can be about what we expect the other groups to do. So, for example, my colleagues at Stanford, they've asked people in the US how likely they thought the other political party would be to engage in partisan violence. And then half of those people received a correction based on real data, indicating that only a very small percentage of the other side would actually support or engage in violence. And then the other half didn't receive any corrective information. Those who received the corrections were significantly less likely to support others' violence or to say that they would engage in violence themselves. Now, what we've observed is that political, ethnic, and religious factions are doing the exact opposite of correcting meta perceptions. They're promoting errors in meta perceptions. Why would they be doing this? Well, many of you in the room, I'm sure, are familiar with the notion of the security dilemma. When one state increases, for example, its military strength or its artillery, other states nearby have to choose whether to follow suit. And if they do, that potentially leads to an arms escalation that no state actually really wants. And so I would argue that meta perceptions are the psychological analog of this. The message is they hate you, so it is not only acceptable, it is incumbent on you to hate them back. And the reason that this is so dangerous is because almost any behavior is morally acceptable if it's done in self-defense. So these victimhood messages begin to legitimize violence, democratic backsliding, and so on. And it shows up in drumming up support for policy, as in the case of Brexit or making America great again. The idea here is something has been taken from you, and all you're asking for is to be restored. So who could possibly fault that kind of an ask? By promulgating these misperceptions, I'd argue that group leaders are building coalitions against their opponents and talking their members into conflict and violence. And our responsibility in the scientific community and the global community more broadly is urgently to start talking them down. And looking forward, I think that individuals, institutions, and governments have an incredible responsibility and challenge to communicate accurately just how inaccurate these misperceptions are. Maybe we are much closer in our values and desires than we actually believe. The challenge, of course, is that people have unprecedented access to volumes of information, and they need to see how much distributions of attitudes, values, and priorities overlap. And so I'll just take one example of this. Recently was done in the context of climate change. In one series of surveys, 80 to 90% of Americans underestimate the prevalence of support for major climate change mitigation processes. So the idea here is that they live in a false social reality. They think that only a very small minority of citizens support climate action, whereas the true numbers range from almost 70 to 80%. So what I'd argue is that the provision of trustworthy, reliable information from, again, trustworthy sources to a data literate public is going to be paramount for large scale collective coordination. So with that, I'll stop. So I'm happy to take any questions.